So what I'm doing is creating some Atari ST Digidrums. Now this is something that people ask me about on Twitter and on the internet, and it's something that I discuss quite a lot with even super experienced musicians. It can be hard to get the Atari Digidrums sounding good. Now, I'm not going to say that I've got a foolproof method that always works, but I'm going to go over my method of doing Digidrums and explain how that process works. The first thing about Digidrums that I have found works well is to use old PCM sample equipment with either 8-bit or a 12-bit sample resolutions. I've found that if the sounds are lo-fi to begin with, that works really well. That's why last night I was sampling all the drum sounds that I could find for the gwEm K1M, which is a 8-bit rompler from the late 80s, and people call it the poor man's Roland D50, which is a little bit cruel in a way, but it is really the poor man's D50. It sounds really good in a kind of crunchy 8-bit kind of way, which I like, and they're pretty cheap to get hold of. So the idea is that I'm going to prepare a small drum kit, maybe just bass drum, snare drum, hi-hat, maybe a ride cymbal. And I'll do this for the Atari STe sound chip, which is a 8-bit sound chip using DMA. And then I will do the sounds again, but for the 4-bit YM sample playback, and you can hear how different they sound at each stage. But I'll start by playing you these samples that I got last night from the gwEm. Yeah, I think those 4 sounds will work really well. These are stereo samples, so I'm going to convert the whole thing into mono. In this case, I'm going to split stereo to mono, and I'm just going to take out the second channel. On these drum sounds, some of them were hard panned on the gwEm K1, so I don't care about the other part. Then we'll go through each individual sound in turn. This sound is the kick drum. So I think that will sound really good on the Atari. Let me, first of all, I'll normalize the volume level, which you do by doing the amplification effect. And Audacity always comes back with the maximum amplification, so it kind of normalizes it for you already. And then I'll chop the start and the tail off it. Right, so let's listen to this kind of chopped kick drum. Nice and punchy. Now this is where I flick to maxYMiser. When you go to the help section and you go into DMA and you scroll to the second page, it will give you all the native replay rates that the Atari STe supports. Now, I'll cover YM Digidrums a bit later, but let's talk about STe for the beginning. So the highest sample rate is 50 kilohertz. Actually, it's 50,066 hertz. But it also supports these slower rates. Now, to get the best quality, you obviously use the highest. In any case, these are 8-bit samples. So let me flick back. What I do to convert the sample rate is here in project rate. I'm going to change that to the STe rate. It won't sound any different because that's how Audacity works and that's what we want. Now, I'm going to play that in the STe and you'll see why different processing is required. So you could do export and export audio. and then I'll put it into my Atari hard disk. And what you want to do is export it as raw headerless signed 8-bit PCM. So that's saved that Kawaii K1 kick drum in raw format. Let's switch back. You have to set a few modes in maxYMiser first. So in the config mode, you change STe DMA to NAT, which is native. So that's all those native rates. Then I go to the final channel, which is the STe DMA channel. Then in the Digidrum section, I can load that sample that I just saved. There it is. So now we can play it. There it is. Sounds all right. It's noisier because of the fact we've converted it from a 16-bit sample down to an 8-bit sample. And the problem is this: it is the buzzer bass. The buzzer on the YM is always playing back at the same volume level. So if I just do a basic, create quickly a basic buzzer and just put it over the top of that kick drum, you'll hear that the kick drum's far too quiet, basically. It's actually not as bad as I thought that it might be, but it is still too quiet. One easy thing that you can do in maxYMiser is the SEX, which is the sample editor extension. So I can just increase the volume here. Now that sample was already normalized in Audacity, so by doing this, it will actually start to clip the sample, which doesn't always achieve great results, but it does sometimes pay off. I think in the case of this sample, it will work because it's nearly there already. It has worked, but you can hear what's happened to the sample. The tail of it has become quite noisy due to the 8-bit resolution of the sample. You could shorten the sample to cut out the noisy end part, or we can work with it some more in Audacity, which is what I'm going to do now. So here's the sample, right? Definitely sounds smoother than on the STe. You could put this through a compressor, and Audacity has something like a compressor. So there is a distortion option in Audacity, and I like to use the leveler, which is sort of a kind of a compressor. And you can specify how much leveling it applies with this slider here. So if you apply 5, it does loads. Too much, really. As you can hear, that's pretty distorted. So if I do I normally do around 2 or 3. Let's listen to that. That's not bad. Here's the original. So with 2, it's kind of acceptable. Let's go for 3. Maybe too much. So back to 2, and I'll apply that. Now this will sound better in the Atari because the sound's already louder because of the leveler distortion I've applied. We might still have to clip it on the STe though. So it's louder and clearer than it was. I do generally still end up clipping the sample, but it's going to be a lot less of a clip. You see, I've just increased the volume once. Each of these clicks increases it by 1.5 dB. So I think before I clicked it 3 or 4 times, and now I just needed to do a 1.5 dB of clipping to get it to be at the right volume level versus the Digidrums. The tail's not quite so bad, and the reason is that I've preserved the resolution of the sample by maximizing it in the 16-bit range. I've been able to reduce the quantization noise when converting it to 8-bit later. So what I'm going to do now is the snare drum, and I'll be able to show you some different techniques with that. All right, here's the snare drum. So I'll just trim it like before. Well, it's a good sounding snare, and I think it will sound good on the STe. Have a look at the frequency response of this snare now. So what you can see here, you have the main fundamental frequency around 137 Hertz, which you will definitely hear. But there's also these other peaks, 10 Hertz, and they're at 34 Hertz. Now, the minimum frequency the ST is able to reproduce is 30 Hertz. And I know this because it's actually in the manual of the ST. So what I'm going to do now is to apply an EQ which will take out everything below 30 Hertz. And I find that taking out all the low end beneath 30 Hertz is very good for break beats as well. So the situation is this: the low frequencies consume most of the amplitude. So if you start applying like that distortion to the sound, or you apply clipping to the sound, what distorts first is the bass that you can't really hear anyway. So the problem is to make the samples loud enough on the ST. So if you take out the bass, you can make the sound louder without it distorting. Let's apply that now to the sample. And you can hear that a bunch of low end has been removed. Let's export that. Now here's a little maximizer trick for you. If you press F9, you get all of the Digidrum sounds playable like drum pads on the keys. Right, the snare drums are very quiet. I'm going to increase the volume of it by clipping it in maximizer with the built-in sample editor. That sounds really good like that, actually, even just clipped. So I promised you some 4-bit Digidrums. Now these samples are all at 50 kilohertz. Now if I wanted to play these on the normal YM, it's going to use up loads and loads of CPU. This control here states the rate of your Digidrum. And you can only really go up to 25 kilohertz on maximizer. Anything higher, the CPU can't handle. And actually, I try to use a rate of around 6 kilohertz for the YM Digidrums. And that's what guys like Mad Max and stuff used to use. So to create a Digidrum instrument, I set the volume envelope to maximum. And in the mixer, I put D in the timer column, which is Digidrum. And then I choose the sample for the Digidrum with this field here. So that's the bass drum. Now that's that same sample being played back at 6 kilohertz. Back to the maxYMiser help. We want to go down 1, 2, 3 octaves, which will change the 50 kilohertz sample into a 6 kilohertz sample. And I can match the sample rate with this control here. So that's going to play back at 6,269 hertz. So let's pitch this sample up by 3 octaves. That's the first one. Second one, it's starting to sound more like a kick drum. There's the third one. But it sounds pretty awful. And this is where you have to start putting a bit more effort in. Now that's super crunchy because when I play that sample on the DMA channel, it's playing back 8-bit 50 kilohertz. But the YM is only playing back 4-bit at, in this case, 6.2 kilohertz. So a good starting point is just to really, really clip the sample. And you'll hear as I increase the volume, the sample clips more, and it starts to sound better. That's quite good. So that, I would say that is usable. You can hear the click at the end if you listen. That's because there is a DC offset when you play back samples from the YM. But I think we can do a lot better than that if we go back to Audacity. Let's load up that bass drum sample again. As you know, last time we used the distortion and the leveler option and we set the degree of leveling to 2. Now you need a lot more level than that if you're going to do a 4-bit digidrum. Let's try a 4. You can see the distortion's kind of rounded the edges of the kick drum off. Let's normalize it again. And I will change the project rate to back to 50 kilohertz. Now here there'll be another trick in a minute. So I'm going to load that sample into bank 4, the distorted one that I've just made. So I need to pitch the sample up again. It's already sounding less crunchy, right? And this time, rather than smashing the volume increase a few times to get the level to match with the buzzer, I've only had to press it once. So we've got a fairly clean sounding, I would say, kick drum sample, although clearly it's very crunchy still. So what maxYMiser was doing when I was pitching it up here with this octave control, it was actually chopping samples, individual samples out of the sound. And it wasn't applying any filtering. So what you actually get is the Nyquist effect coming in, and then you start getting aliasing, which is where some of that weirdish high end was coming from. Now, sometimes aliasing can be super cool, like on the SP1200 you get that kind of legendary high end kind of crunch. But it's not always a good thing. So I'm exporting this at the 50 kilohertz for the STe. Now, like you can see here, what I'm actually playing it is at 62, 69 hertz. So I'm going to change the project rate to be the same. And let me export that now. Now this will cause Audacity to apply filtering directly, so you won't get the aliasing. Right, let's hear how different this version will sound. Still crunchy, but not quite as crunchy, I think. I do want to listen to how it was before, though. Right, so I'll flick between the two versions now. This is the version which had the filtering. And here is the version without it. I definitely prefer the version with the filtering. It's less crunchy on the top end. So let's finish this off by doing the snare drum. Not bad. That snare drum's sounding a bit better than the kick drum did, I think. You can continue just to increase the amount of clipping. It can sometimes sound quite cool. I think it sounds good there. I'm actually fairly pleased with that. So that's the YM, and I'll flick to the DMA Digidrums as it plays. It is quite difficult to predict how it's going to sound. If we start to include like a YM hi-hat, it will lift the overall effect. Once you add in the YM hi-hat, it brings more, a bit more fidelity. That is a good trick demo, trimming the samples so you can't hear the noisy tails. Let's load up a Mad Max tune just to see, and we'll load Wings of Death by Mad Max, because that has very good digidrums. Those are indeed very short drum samples. Let's compare it to my effort. I don't know, I'm not going to say I'm better, but here's Jochen. gwEm. Yeah, I'd say they're as good as the Wings of Death. I'm going to copy a bit of the Mad Max trick and shorten the length of the snare drum. The more I listen to those digidrums, the more satisfied I am with them. I think the last trick was Damo's trick of trimming that snare so it was a bit shorter and we lose the messy tails. And on that note, I will say good night. See you all next week. It's been a good one. Cheers. Bye-bye.